Hi, Violet.
Hi, Robin.
So I want to do something to start. I don't know if you noticed out front, they're doing a visualization of this talk. Did you see that by the front door?
No, I didn't.
So it's pretty excellent, actually.
Okay.
I don't know if people in this room have seen it, but they're sort of visualizing the word count, sort of the incident of different words like
really?
energy or space or aliens or whatever. But I think we should hack the visualization by choosing some word and just saying it like 50 times. And I want you to choose the word.
You want me to choose the word?
Yes.
I get accused of using words repeatedly in talks, so I'm a little shy about doing something like this. But how about the word conversation?
Conversation.
Yeah.
Conversation.
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 Because I have some questions for you about conversation, actually.
Okay.
Because you are a man of, you're a writer, and you're a man of many, many hats, and you have done a lot of really interesting things in a lot of different media forms. You've been at Current, you worked for Wired for a while, now you're at Twitter. And so you've been involved in a lot of conversations. And as a writer, you're naturally involved in conversation. So what I want to know is, with all of the different, and sort of, some of the things that you've done are a little anarchistic, because you're a little bit of a, well, you say a media inventor, because you like to mold and shape different types of media and channel different ideas and thoughts through media. And I think you probably spend a lot of time observing how these ideas go and where they go in different conversations. So what I want to know is how you see the arc of what you're doing with what you've done in media. How are you interested in changing the overall conversation in the media that you work in?
Okay, conversation.
And if you want to do it on a macro level, you could, I mean, for instance, like, I take a look at your oeuvre and I'm like, wow, this guy's done Pointer. I mean, a lot of really interesting, cool stuff. And now you're at Twitter and you're like the media dude at Twitter. So you're running a blog where you're helping like MTV do stuff with Twitter. And I'm like, okay, so how does that, I mean, how do you see yourself changing this larger conversation about what these certain garden variety corporations can do with the individual power of the conversation on Twitter?
Yeah. Wow, that's a gigantic question. I'm actually.
But I was really wondering, because part of me just wanted to come up here and just go, dude, what are you doing?
What is going on? I will tell you. There's a couple different levels, but I'll actually be completely honest. And this is actually one of the reasons I was sort of asking Jill about vocation and kind of what leads you into different things, especially in the beginning, but throughout all the things I've done, I've actually always been driven. So you're right that I like to observe and I like to sort of theorize and come up with new models and things. But I've always been driven pretty fundamentally by, I don't know, it's almost emotional. It's just the sense of what's actually the most fun and the most fulfilling. And I think there's probably going to be some resonance here between us, because just as a case in point, when I was first starting out, I was doing this was like 2002, 2003, just when blogs were sort of this new thing and everyone was sort of getting excited about them and discovering them. And I was doing two things at once. I was writing traditional articles, long 3,000 word things. They were still posted online. This wasn't even dead trees. It was still all on the web.
Okay.
But I would sort of post these long things with no comments, just very like, here it is, a perfect piece of finished journalism for you to read and enjoy. Okay. At the same time, I'd be writing blog posts with comments and sort of connected to all these other things.
Right.
And the difference, and we're talking on the most basic emotional, like what makes you excited to do your work every day level, the blog posts were blowing the traditional stuff out of the water.
So much more satisfying
as
a writer.
Satisfying is the right word, exactly. And I mean, really, to this day, I look at people who do the other kind of stuff, who sort of create this work and then put it out there, and it's like throwing pennies down a well, and like and never hearing the splash.
Right.
I don't know how they do it. So
I don't know how they live with themselves, actually.
Fundamentally, yeah. I mean, fundamentally, there's some big ideas, but it's a little more, I don't know, almost animal than that. Just kind of like, where I've gotten positive feedback in terms of like, oh, this is good, this is fun, I can do this another day, I can do this another day. That's what took me to Twitter. The fact that Twitter was this kind of, it takes that feedback loop and makes it even faster and more sort of nourishing, I guess.
So do you think that you were driven by it sounds, I mean, it's very, very familiar what you're talking to me about, sort of, seeing the big difference between, old school media and journalism presentation, regardless of all of the other factors involved, just as a writer, and then suddenly being in a position where you're actually having a relationship with your readers, and an ongoing relationship with the material, and also, realizing that you're subverting the channels of distribution. And so it sounds to me almost like, I wonder, is it that conflict that drew you into moving into alternate forms of media and media distribution?
When you say conflict, do you mean that sort of old media, new media divide and that sort of insurgent,
because you're sort of
rebel
between
thing?
both, and you're like, this feels good and this doesn't feel good, and
I'll
you
say-
also seem like you've sort of intuited your way through it
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, intuition. But that's another great word. Vocation and intuition. Those are both good, I don't know, tags. Vocation, 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 vocation.
I think we'll win with conversation, though.
I've actually, the battle, the sort of antagonism has never been super appealing to me. I've always liked the synthesis more. I mean, something that I always tell journalists, I've been telling them for a long time, is that you do the best work when you take the values, the kind of old-fashioned values of journalism, like, honesty and authenticity and veracity and verification and fairness, not necessarily balance, but fairness, and you bake those into new stuff. You can do that. You can use those values as effectively in a Twitter feed as you can writing a 30,000-word piece for the New York Times Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I always find the sort of the old versus new, like, throw down, like in panels like this, right, where like I'd be from a newspaper and you'd be a blogger and we'd like
I've done that before.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's so boring and so not true anyway. So why bother?
Yeah, it ends up being not productive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So how are you changing the conversation with what you're doing at Twitter? Or do you see yourself as doing that?
I think so, and part of it, it turns out that it happens mostly, this is something I've learned actually, just in the last 9 months or so working at Twitter. You can make big pronouncements, and you can sort of, put forward big theories and, sort of think pieces about the future of media, but it really happens in terms of actually making progress and getting new work out there that is sort of different. In terms of actually doing like media invention, it totally happens person by person. It happens sitting down, I mean, not like this, but in a meeting or over coffee with someone at a media company who's sort of curious and maybe doesn't want to admit that they're curious about this stuff, and talking it through with them and coming up with something. And maybe it shouldn't have surprised me, but the degree to which it really is this sort of just like person by person, organization by organization. Battle's not the right word because it's not a battle. It's more just it's a campaign, maybe like a political campaign, and you really do win it by like knocking on one door and then knocking on the next door and knocking on the next door.
So you see it as an individualistic process, or a process that has more of an individual or a directly connected experience involved.
I think so, and you have to sort of take new ideas. I mean, if you're talking about using Twitter, you can't just say, everybody, use Twitter. You have to sort of mold it into the stuff that people are working on. So if it's MTV, you sort of, you meet them halfway, talking about like big spectacles, and you talk about musicians on Twitter, and you talk about all of their fans talking about Jersey Shore on Twitter or whatever it is. If you're talking to the New York Times, it's a very different conversation. You're talking about news and breaking news and, sort of learning interesting things about Chile's reaction to the Chilean miners or whatever it is. The sort of the core idea is the same, but you have to be specific.
Well,
I'm increasingly skeptical of giant overarching theories sort of handling everything.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. I'm thinking of Twitter in terms of a use case, because what it is it's just a rapid status update connect tool, essentially. And there will be other Twitters. And what's interesting is to see the impact of something that is an instant status update from one individual that grows like a spore and moves, and of course, all the exciting data mining and graphing that goes along with, seeing how news stories are told and how news stories are sourced increasingly through this type of a communication model. And I'm wondering how you see these individually driven, or people, I mean, it eventually becomes crowdsourcing, but it all starts with an individual or two, changing what happens with news media.
Well, so I'll tell you one thing that's really important, but I want to sort of connect it back around to you, because this was my...
you kind of geek out on news media.
What's that?
You kind of geek out on news media.
I completely geek out on news media,
I can
absolutely. Media in general, so the one thing that's super interesting to me, I've had this on the brain just because I've been reading about this a lot recently, and also because we were talking earlier, there were conversations about things like lenses and pictures of far-off planets and telescopes and things like that. I think one of the really quiet revolutions, maybe it's not as quiet as I think it is, But one of the sort of things that has snuck up on us is that everybody is a photographer all the time. Like the way photography fits into our lives is so weird now. I mean, if you just think about the way people thought about cameras or taking pictures, even 4 years ago, it's completely different now.
Absolutely.
So obviously that has huge, almost unimaginable implications for news when suddenly something happens and you sort of capture it from 95 different angles and you can find ways to sort of synthesize that. I mean, there's no question, this is already happening, but there's just no question that the signature images of big events are increasingly going to come from sort of people's cell phones or whatever they end up being called, sort of there on the scene. But it changes more than just news, right? I mean, this changes the way we think about ourselves and communicating with people, and I think it probably changes sex, too, or changes relationships. And I'm curious, when you think, because I know that's something that you spend a lot of time thinking about and writing about and talking about, maybe most of your time. But photography, I don't know enough about the overall sort of context over not just the last 5 years, the last 20 years, or the last 100 years, but when you think about phones and maybe Twitter and photography, how does this kind of change things? Is it changing things?
In terms of sexuality?
Yeah, and the way we express ourselves sexually, the way we sort of, just the whole sort of culture of sex.
It's changed almost every aspect of sexuality, absolutely. I mean, and we're talking in Western nations, certainly, where we're free to do this. Mm-hmm. And it's changed the idea of self because we're given much more of a mirror and much more of an accurate mirror of taking a look at ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And one we can control a little more, right? I always feel like we've all become masters of self-portraiture now. Maybe I'm...
Oh, well, definitely masters of the MySpace angle.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that... I think that there's a lot of myth around how much control you have when you take pictures of yourself and what you do with them, mm-hmm. or pictures of other people and what you do with them mm-hmm. online. Mm-hmm. I think that what I think is particularly interesting about the way that pictures and the ability of everyone to take pictures has changed sexuality is that it's been part of the gigantic disruption of the porn distribution complex, and what it's allowed people to do is to start to make their own pornography and show themselves and start to show what they actually really want to see, and show a much more realistic and I think healthier picture of human sexuality rather than the mass-produced stereotypes that we had been accustomed to seeing for decades after decades, mm-hmm. or having to go source out secretly, which then maybe didn't also present a very healthy portrait of sexuality. So I think that overall it's a disruption that's incredibly good overall culturally. I think it's incredibly empowering, especially for women, because it's allowed women to take control of their image back to themselves, not just in the way they present themselves and saying, hey, my unenhanced body is actually really hot, and here's a whole bunch of people mm-hmm. that think so, mm-hmm. but also in that, in order to get distribution, if a woman wants to monetize her image, she doesn't need to go to a man and have him do something to help her monetize it, mm-hmm. or give her money to anyone else. Mm-hmm. So it's also eliminating a lot of the myths and the stereotypes of women doing things because they're being coerced in a sexual context, women being less empowered around their own sexuality and having less control of it, and also women needing to go to men. I mean, it's a heteronormative assumption, of mm-hmm. course, mm-hmm. because by and large we're dealing with the gender binary, but it's actually, that and the media distribution disruption that we've been, excitedly surfing, at least you and I have, mm-hmm. for the past 10 years, I think it's huge, and I think it's incredibly healthy.
Let's zoom it out a little more, just because mm-hmm. this is a long now and sort of long-term thinking event, because I'm thinking now back in terms of news. I think there might actually be some interesting, surprising parallels here. So in terms of news, so of course the most recent thing of the last 5 years is this democratization of this sort of image production, mm-hmm. but really the fact that news is largely visual is itself a pretty new thing. I mean, yes. It's fun, I don't know if you've ever done it, to go back and look at old newspapers, and they're just like all text and sort of like a woodcut drawing in the corner, and you right. realize that the news, it was your imagination. You didn't maybe even know what the president really looked like.
Well, it was also storytelling, which mm-hmm. is something that I think that we need to not lose.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. So with news, we've seen this rise of sort of the image, and especially for people who read a lot and are sort of always online consuming words, I think it's easy to forget that most people sort of get their news and process news really visually. I mean, it really is sort of salient images and sort of clips of video and people on a TV screen. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much of a...
In Western cultures. What
do you mean?
Well, in a lot of... I've recently been doing a little bit of research about non-Western cultures and open internet access and access to news and media and culture. And not a lot of the world has access to an open internet. You know, they don't have access to YouTube. They don't have access to you know, the upper classes certainly do, but by and large, a lot of very large nations don't have access to this type of news media.
Well, of course, but they still have TV, right? And TV is, I mean, for as much as we talk about the internet, TV is still...
Unless it's state-controlled.
But even then, so the sort of the provenance of the images is sort of questionable, but it's still images. You still get it through images.
Okay.
But
continue.
But so
Rabbit hole.
To connect it back around, and I don't know how much of a historian of sex you are, if you kind of like zoom way out and look at the last few hundred years or even like the last 1,000 years, does just the rise of images, you know, photography, video, does that change things? What did sex even in the culture of sex look like before it was easy to, you know, mass produce and distribute images?
Before the mass distribution of images, well, I think that for those who are sighted, I think that inherently sex is a very visual thing anyway, because sex, if you're not looking at the act as you do it, I would say 9 times out of 10, most people have a running fantasy in their head of either what they're doing or what they're thinking of or something else. Because sex is so reliant on fantasy, and because the majority of the amount of sex that most people have is masturbation, and that is a very fantasy-reliant thing. So it's a matter of, are you talking about images that you're running in your head as a tape, or images that were sort of, you know, finding in a mass-produced way? I mean, sure, you could say, oh, well, there were, you know, daguerreotypes. There were, you know, you could go, you know, the guys could go and watch a smoker, you know, at their buddy's house if they had a stag film or something like that. And now it's, you know, it's 4chan. It's you know, it's just like go wherever you want, and you can find things that you wanted that make you want to take your brain out and put it in a pile of bleach and, you know, wish you never saw it. But you can also find a lot of things that are what you've always imagined, and oftentimes enacted by professionals in safe contexts. So I don't know that we haven't ever been a sexually visual culture.
It's interesting. One interesting thing.
Good Psychology Today article about the power of fantasy and masturbation and how important images are.
I mean, I would love to know, and it might just be a question that's impossible to answer, how much, because it's feedback loops, right? I think a lot about feedback loops and the way those work. And seeing movies changes the way that we visualize things. You know, before there were movies, I would love to know. I'd love to be able to do that. And I think it's just impossible to kind of, you know or hear described how people visualize things, like what the mind's movie camera. See, even we can't get away from it, the vocabulary. We talk about the mind's movie camera, or you said the tape in your mind, which I love, because of course we don't even use tape anymore. I know, but we still, and you see these great layers. In the news,
is so-and-so's sex tape? You're like, what tape?
There's no tape. There was never any tape. It was on a phone.
Stop using the word tape.
I love that stuff. That's another. I will say that's another reason. Back to your original question, why do I like this stuff? I like it because it doesn't just sort of sit out here. It affects us. You know, stories and different kinds of media. Give them a little time, and they actually kind of change our brains and what it means to be human too. I think that's pretty cool.
In a better way?
I think so. I'm an optimist. I actually think so. I think all of this stuff synthesizing together, kind of stewing in this big pot, I think the soup gets tastier over time.
Very good.
But good other people might disagree. It's definitely different, and that's at least always interesting.
Yes. Evolution.
Conversation.
Conversation.
Conversation, 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 conversation. Okay.
Thank you, Robin.
A pleasure.